Hey everybody! So this is a one of a couple of quick run-throughs on UVs that I wanted to get to the other day, but time is not our pal. So I'm going to start off real simple and then show you some subtleties that you might be running into. So whenever you create any primitive in Maya initially, let's say we're going to create a cube, for the most part it's set up default to come with its own UVs built in, which is very handy. So if in that case you were just going to apply a texture to it or a material, and I just happen to have a material set up just with a texture map on it, for the most part they'll lay out well. So you look at this and you're like, well, that was good and that's very handy. You can create primitives in Maya without a UV map for some odd reason should you want to do that. You could go back into the same thing, go to the cube, select over here, and you can actually just turn off the UVs. So now when we create the cube, even if we apply the same material, that Lambert 2, it knows it has a texture map associated, but it doesn't have any way to actually decide how to apply it to this cube. So the cube's sort of like, well, I need further instructions. And UVs are those instructions. Simple enough. Under the polygon menu, you can up here, there's two menus that are kind of handy for us for our UV work. One is create UVs, one's edit UVs. And in this case, a simple enough thing to do would be, we could apply a planar, but then we have more work to do. Cylindrical, it's clearly not a cylindrical object, and it's not a sphere. So let's try automatic mapping. And automatic mapping, if we look at what it does here, will basically project UV coordinates, the map of how to handle this texture, onto an object. You can decide how many sides it does it from, what's the most important to you, fewer pieces or less distortion. But the default, if we just leave it at default, should give us a pretty good projection. So if we hit apply, you'll get this. Okay? And what it's doing is it's projecting the texture or the mapping coordinates from all 6 sides, top, bottom, front, back, and left, right. Now the layout it gives you, if you look at over here, is actually quite different than the layout you get. Let me just take this guy, and we'll move more to the side here, and let me just create one more cube. Here's another cube, and let me just put that texture map back on them. Boop, there you go. If we look at this guy, I turned off the make with UVs, so let's create with UVs and say apply. But you'll notice that the layout for the UVs on this object, the default object in Maya, is actually different, and they end up laying differently on it. Actually, this is probably a better layout because you're getting more pixels per side or per face. So you can see that the numbers here, we're getting a higher density. We have 5.5 or 5 1/3 over here, where we only get a straight 4 over here. And that's simply because the layout of the faces on the UVs here is all connected. It's one single, what they call island or shell. And over here, they're all separate shells. So I can grab each one of these shells separately and move it around. And if I did that, if I could find the side that we're moving, let's see, there it is. Where this shell exists will determine what pixels on your texture map are actually going to work or show up underneath it. This over here is one complete unit. So if we wanted to move this shell, if I go back into shell select mode, oops, being tricky, UVs, and I select this entire shell, as I move this, it will move all as one unit. But in either case, we could either cut these UVs all into separate pieces. We could be in here, we could go into edge mode, and let's say this edge. Sorry. This edge here, we could actually go up here to the separate UVs, and then this becomes a separate island, so I can actually pop that off. Whereas all of this is still one unit, okay? Whereas different, we could go into this object, and I could go into edge mode figure out which side or where this edge belongs. If I can get this edge selected, and you can actually see, if I turn this map off in the background, each one of these edges has a brother edge. So you see this one lights up over here, this one lights up there, this one lights up to this one, this, let's track it down, it's probably over here somewhere, let's see, ooh, these two go together. So we could actually sew these together, or I could click an edge on the actual object like this, and I could, this little button here is the move and sew. So what it'll do is it'll put those guys together. Then I could go over to this side, I could select this edge and say sew those guys together, just like that. And then I could select this edge and say move those guys together, grab this edge, move those guys together, and if we wanted to, we could grab this over here and that'd move that together. So I didn't need to sew it together over here. We could easily just go over here and that'll grab the top end and then move that all up over there, and then this button will basically pack this into a place, and then it puts it all back together again. But basically what you have is UVs on a per face basis determine what pixels on what map are going to show up based on where you lay them out. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's grab these two guys and delete them for a second, because I want to show you something interesting. Let's say I create a default cylinder in Maya. Okay, so this is a default cylinder in Maya. And let's just assign that Lambert 2 to it. Okay, so you may be looking and you're like, well, that's pretty ugly. And it looks good on the top, and it looks good on the bottom. But if you look at the way, and for whatever bizarre reason, the default UVs are set up in Maya, they're set up like this. So the circumference of this cylinder, the sides, are all squished together like this, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, particularly, let's say, if you were painting this texture. Let's say you had a rust or metal and you were painting off the top and you wanted to come down the sides. Well, if you look at this face, or the distance of this face, it matches the distance of one of these faces on the side. So over here, clearly, this distance of a face here is a heck of a lot bigger than one of its mates, which would be, let's say, over here, which is why this looks so tremendously distorted. We can fix that. We can go back into select the island mode, and one of the things we can do is we can actually just open this up like this and just stretch it to the sides. Okay, and now I think we're in a better spot. So you look at this now, and that looks like it's going to match a whole lot better. But even the default UVs in Maya, then, if you notice, can be terribly distorted. Just knowing what map you're going to have underneath here is going to be key. So if there was a different marking or rust pattern that would be painted from the top over here, and this was the top of, let's say, an oil barrel, you may want to take this and move it over here so it picks up that material. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So every primitive in Maya comes with its own set of UVs, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But it's generally easily fixed. When you go into select or work in the UV editor, we have different options. What you've seen for the most part is when we can select UVs, which show up very much like vertices, but they're lit up green. Okay, and we can take those and move those around. You can actually go in and you can, what I was doing before when we were sewing them, you can select edges. So I can actually select an edge. And the edges actually, if I'll turn off the material so you can see, the edges correspond over here to edges on the actual geometry. Okay, so for whatever reason, if you were getting distortion or you wanted to introduce distortion, you could actually move these. So if I was over here and I just grabbed those edges like this, and I wanted to move them, we could move these over here, or you could move individual faces. So you have a lot of options as far as what you can do inside of Maya to get your UVs looking the way you want. Okay, so let's get rid of him. I have a couple of props that I want to run through because they introduce unique challenges in UVs. Now I had another video with these, but I'm actually probably going to get rid of that because there's more fun things that we can be doing. So anyway, let's just look at the plate first, probably the simplest of the two. So what we have here is a simple plate, and it has a material but no UVs. So if I click this, you get this sort of like shiny looking blend sort of a color. So just from the shape of it, I could say that I probably want the texture projected down on it so that it covers the entire surface. So if I drew a picture of a plate, that it would show up just like that. So let's go back into our Create UVs. I think planar is going to be a terrific choice for this. And let me just reset these. Okay. As it is now, it's set to project from the x-axis. Okay. Now, if you look at your axes over here, that would be from this direction. So if I projected from this direction, we would get a, well, let's project from this direction and I'll show you what it gives you. Like this, we'll select this and put this in object mode and hit apply. And then you get this sort of horrifyingly distorted looking projection that's really just this high, and it gives you that, which is pretty awful. So that's clearly not it. As we originally anticipated, down the y-axis is probably a much more likely candidate. So we can hit apply and reproject them from the top, which is cool, and I think that's going to work out much better. So as you can see, they project down and they're looking pretty good, and this may be fine depending on whether or not you have a separate texture map that you want for, let's say, the detail of like porcelain design or something on the top. But if you look at the bottom, it's actually the exact same projection, just punched right through. And that if you look at our detail here, all of our letters are actually all backwards. Okay, so this is where you come into one of those situations that, let's say this map over here was a 512, 512, or a 1024 1K map or something like that. A lot of detail. We're getting, we paint this, we're going to get a lot of great detail on the map. Problem is that if we want a different design down here, let's say the manufacturer, or you just have a different gold, like a gold leaf pattern on the bottom of this, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to split this plate into two sections. So, whether or not you decide to do that, if you're ever actually going to see the bottom of the plate, that's part of your decision for the efficiency of your scene. But as far as actually doing it, it's not particularly complicated. What we need to do is we need to go in and find a seam, and this plate happens to have one. If it didn't, you could introduce one pretty easily. And what we'll do is we'll just select that edge right there along the circumference of the plate. Okay, and all I'm going to do is hit the scissors like that. And now what that should do is slice this plate into two UV sections. Okay, simplest way then we do that over here is we can separate these out. Is we can just hit this button up here. It kind of looks like Jenga or something like that, and select the faces to be moved into UV space. So we can just grab these and separate them that way. So now we get the two sections of the plate. Now, going back to this for a second, two things are obvious. One is that our texture pattern on the plate is much larger, meaning we have less pixels per section to work with. The next thing that's probably fairly obvious is that we now have our texture map is now backwards in both of these. So what we need to do is we can either just take that into account, paint our map and flip our map, or what we can do is we can flip the UV islands. So in that case, what you might want to do is you could grab one of these UV islands, and there's the one on the bottom. And over here, you have different options. The bottom two are for rotating clockwise and counterclockwise. And over here is what we can do is we can flip these two. Okay, so what we can do there is, if you notice, flip that. So when we're painting this, we're painting and it's actually showing up the way we want. And then over here, we just need to do the same for this alternate island. Grab this, and we can flip that as well. Okay, so now we have two different sections of paint, so we can actually paint the bottom texture on one, the top texture on the other. They are facing the right way. This is normally, when you see the color red here, a bad thing. It means your textures are inverted, or your UVs are inverted. In this case, if we were just creating one for this plate, or if we had a cup or a saucer or something else like that, since it's on this one plate, that'd be fine because you're looking at it and you're getting the way you want it to appear, which is left to right and right to left. So that'll work out fine. And when we smooth this object like this, what we want to see is we want to see that our UVs do not become distorted. One of the things that you'll find as you're working with your objects is sometimes they'll look terrific in their low detail, kind of unsmoothed version, and then you smooth the mesh, or you actually go in and you apply a smooth to the mesh, and your UVs go insane. And that's going to happen on this one because I wanted to show you what you might have to do, or kind of a workflow that you could start to work with. But having clean geometry to begin with is probably the most important part. And so there you go. As far as the plate's ready to rock. Now let's move on to this kind of low poly paint or milk container. Okay, so he's got the same material, no UVs, without any particular concern of how it's going to look. We just need UVs on here before we can do anything. They don't even need to be correct, but this is actually going to get us pretty far along. So we're going to go to Create UVs, and I'm going to go back to Auto Map, and we'll just hit it with an Auto Map. All right, and let's take a look at what that gave us. And it looks pretty darn good, actually. It's not bad at all. You can see here we can read the letters, they're in the right direction, and we can read the letters and they're in the right direction, and everything's in good shape. These seem to be upside down, which we can actually see. This is the upside down panel here, which is kind of peculiar that it chose to do that. And we have a bottom there. That's an easy fix. So all we need to do is we can go select the UV island, just tap like that. And over here, we can just rotate it like that. Okay, so we rotate this thing around, and it appears that you're done. I mean, if you keep this in this state, that looks great. But I want to show you something interesting. Supposing we wanted to put a smooth on this, okay? So let's go under Mesh, and let us smooth this, okay? And it's still not bad. You're looking at that, you're like, that's okay. It's got a smooth on it, pretty clean geometry. I don't see any distortion, so you're golden. And that could be the case, and you may get away and you may be fine. Your geometry could be clean, but let's go into the attribute editor for a second, and let's mess with this. Let's take the smooth modifier, and let's bring the divisions up. Okay, let's bring the division up to 2. Okay, and you might be thinking that's doing pretty good, but if we kind of look at your geometry over here a bit, we're starting to get this kind of tearing in here and in here, and that could be hard to track down. So if you go to 3, I don't know if it gets any better or any worse. It doesn't really change. It looks like what you get at 2 can be kind of crunchy here. So looking at this, you're not 100% sure what to think about that, but there are a couple of settings that you could try, and it's a little bit like a couple of binary switches, 0 and 1, and you might need to set it to 0, 0, and then 1, and then 0, 1, 0. So you might need to experiment, but I'm going to give you an idea of what I think this could be done. Over here we have what to do with the edges, and how the edges layout will obviously affect how your UVs lay out. So in this case, one of the things that we could try is preserve hard edges. It's set to be off, and this does make a change, so we can see that we are getting a change here. I don't know if it's a good change or bad change. This part of it seems to shape up, so we around the edges here, this is looking better. So if we tick this on and off, that looks like it's sharpening it up a little bit. Although we are picking up some distortion over here, but we definitely are getting this more distortion up here. So if you look at this, that looks great, and then that's not so much. So I don't know if that's going to be an acceptable solution? Probably not. So let's take that off for a second and let's look at this. This doesn't seem to do anything, propagate hard edges. So if we leave that on and click this, that does not seem to do anything. Okay. So the next thing you might want to try, so preserve hard edges seems to solve some things. It straightens up these edges, but it causes problems up here. Okay. Another thing you can do is the preserve map borders. Okay. By default, it's going to be set to internal. What you want to do is turn it off. Okay. And you're like, well, that didn't seem to do much of anything. All right, well, let's do that and turn this off. So now we've disengaged preserve hard edges and we've disengaged preserve map borders. Okay, now let's take a look. Now we've got the higher divisions for our smoothing and our UVs are back to normal and they look really good. So sometimes it's just a matter of a few of these under the poly smooth function. So when you put the smooth on it, they're going to be waiting for you in here. And it can be a little bit of an experiment to try to figure it out. Because you can see like there, we turn that off and we turn that back on and they're a little bit messed up. And in here, then we turn this to none. And that's looking pretty good. But in the end, it's going to be a combination in here. Assuming your geometry is clean and your UV shells are sewn properly, you should be able to get a good smoothed result. Okay, this is smooth as well, and our UVs look great. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I got one last thing that I think might be useful to you guys. It's a little bit esoteric, so try and stay with me. So what we'll do here is I'm going to go into the channel box and I'm going to turn that off and I'm going to turn on a curve. And here I have a curve. Okay. Some of this build stuff, or sometimes when you're building things like cables, or you might want to build something like that, you can't necessarily build it straight and then go back and warp it because it just would, be time prohibitive. But I'm going to show you a way and what the problem is when you do it like this. Okay. Let's go into create. I'm going to create a NURBS primitive and I just want a circle, and I'm going to just make like a little circle like that. Okay. What I want to do is I'm going to move the circle to the front of the curve, and I'm not exactly sure I remember where the front of the curve is, but if you do this and you are not sure, what you're looking for is you're looking for the little U and the little square vertice or control vert at the end of it. On the other end, you just have a regular little dot. So if you're curious which end of the curve is the beginning curve, let's say whether you were using for path animation or in our case here an extrude, that's how you can tell. And if for whatever reason you're like, ah crap, I didn't want it to go that way, you can actually reverse your curve. If you go into the surfaces menu, and here's a neat way to do it, you can hold down H and click Shift, H and click left click, we can go right into surfaces there. In the edit curve menu, what we can actually do is once we select a curve, we can reverse the direction. Okay, so by clicking reverse direction now, the little U is here and the box is here. So if you needed your guy to animate, let's say on a railroad track this way as opposed to the other way, that's how you might go about doing it. Okay, so let me just take this curve and we'll reverse it one more time because I kind of put this over here. Extruding in Maya is, in the, let's just say, in the allegory of the dentist world, it's a little bit like tooth cleaning. Especially with that metal pick thing. It's not horrific like UVs have gone terribly wrong and you got to fix them, but it's certainly not a pleasant procedure. Okay, but what we need to do is a few things. If I'm going to be sending this circle along this curve, if we can, we should move it up and get it over to the start of the curve. So one of the ways we can do that, and probably before we do that, the next thing you need to do is turn it up in the right direction, or rotate it up. So what I'm going to do is use the rotate key. I'm going to hold down J, and I'm just going to rotate this up 90 degrees. Okay. Then I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to hit move, and I'm going to hold down one of the snapping tools that's rarely used. Well, because most people don't do this. I'm actually going to try to snap this circle to this curve, and there you can see I actually got it, which is good. The way you do that is you hold down C, grab onto the little dude, and it's curve snapping, and if you can get it, you can sometimes just lay it there and then move back and forth, and that way I can bring it to the beginning of the curve. Okay? So that's looking pretty good. It's a little bit thick, but I can change that after the fact. The only other thing I'm going to want to do with this is I'm just going to freeze its transforms. So everything I do in Maya, whenever you touch anything, just freeze transforms whenever physically possible. Okay, so let's get rid of the edit curves for a second. Actually, one of the things I want to show you else in edit curve really quickly is, let's say you had created a curve and it wasn't particularly curvy. You can not only change the direction or reverse the curve direction, you can actually rebuild your curves as well. In this case, it's actually a pretty good curve. If we go to the attribute editor, I can see that it has 12 spans and it's a 3-degree curve. The degree is the difference between this being a linear curve, kind of point to point to point to point, or a smooth curve. We can actually even just change that. So if we went into rebuild curve really quickly, and I didn't change anything else, but I changed it from a 3-degree curve to a 1-degree curve and hit apply, that's what you get. You get this kind of crunchy curve that's kind of like point to point to point to point, which I'm sure there are uses for. We can also then switch this back to 3. Spans are the number of these sections along the curve. Currently there's 12. If I wanted a more complex curve, let's say I wanted this to be 16, I could hit apply, and when I went into the curve now, you would see you have 16 evenly spaced sections along this curve, which might be great for editing. In our case, it makes no difference, so I'm just going to go back and, just for the simplicity of the model, just take it to 12. Okay? So we have, that's fine, okay? And so what I want to do is I want to extrude this circle along this curve. So I'm going to go into surfaces, and we'll pull that off for a second. And what we want is the extrude. I'm going to reset these, okay? And this is where the tooth cleaning part comes in. Let's just hit the button and see what happens. So we hit apply, and we get this. And this may be what you want. It's certainly the same shape, but you might notice it's not quite on the curve. And, you know, that's just madness. So here we do this. So let's try this. Let's say we change the result position should be at path. Okay? And we hit apply, and that works a little bit better. So now it's actually on the path. Okay, it's not a great curve, but it is what it is. What I'm going to do is delete that. So I know it works. We've got, you know, the curve, it's not twisting, it's on the path, it's groovy. The only thing I want to change now is I don't want NURBs. I want polygons, okay? Normally, I want quads. I don't want triangles. In games, I might want triangles, but honestly, for working purposes, I'd work in quads and then triangulate on the way out. As far as the method goes, we want general. Count would be how many polygons would you like this to be? And you probably have no idea. So general will work fine, okay? As far as the initial tessellization, down here, what I would suggest is a per span count. So for each one of those 12 sections, we can tell it how many subdivisions, which is probably the best way to go. So in our case, I don't really want any. I want one per, so I just want a 1-to-1 on this. Okay? So I'm going to select this, and hit the button. And there you go. So now we just get the 16 sections. Okay? The circle itself had 8 spans, which is why we're getting 8 around the outside. And that'll work great. Now it might look a little bit crunchy, but when we smooth this, we're going to be in really good shape. And the ideal is try to get away with as few edges or sections and spans as you possibly can. The lower you can keep your detail, the cleaner, because you can always go in with smooth after the fact once you have your geometry fixed. The other nice thing here is since it's based on the curve, we can actually go in, and if you were laying your cable and it was going over some stuff and doing things like that, you could change out your cable and do all sorts of neat things to it, and it's still live and connected, so it'll basically rebuild it as you're making any of these changes. So if we grab that, shove this down just a little bit, and so you could actually really customize your cable if it was going around your environment. Okay. Once you get what you like, you can basically select your geometry. It's polygonal geometry, and let's just delete the history. There are no transforms, but we'll freeze transforms. So now we have the geometry. Let's assign that Lambert material to it, and if you look at it, it's horrible. It's doing its best, but it has no idea how to lay out that geometry on this map. And there aren't a lot of great options, okay? You might say, well, let's project it from the top. So let's go back into Polygon menu and say create UVs, planar mapping, down the Y from the top, and you might say apply. And that kind of gives you something. You can certainly see your UVs are kind of working here, but they're basically hash on the sides, and that's not going to work either. Okay, what you really need this to do is you needed to know where all the faces are and basically repeat the pattern along the faces. Okay, that's a little bit tricky to do, and I'm about to do a technique, and if it blows your mind, then don't worry about it. So what I would suggest you do at this stage is we need to go into face mode, okay, and select all the faces of our geometry. Okay. In the UV panel, there is, under polygons, a setting here called Unitize. There's not much to it. That's it. You can create a new UV set or not. We're just not going to, and what we're going to do is we're going to hit apply. Okay, so now we've unitized our material or our geometry. Basically what it's done is it's taken every single face and made it a giant square the full size of the 0 to 1 field here for your UVs. So if you look at here, every single face basically has the entire texture map on it. Okay, well that's not particularly helpful. But what we need to do is sew this whole thing back together again in a way that it can actually figure out the best way to lay it out. The way we're going to do that is we're going to go into the edge mode and select the whole thing. Okay. Now we just need to deselect a couple of edges, because what I want is I want it to sew all the edges except for one seam. Think about if you were cutting like a paper towel roll or something like that and you want to lay it out flat. Basically you would make one incision down the length of it and then allow it to flatten out. Okay, so I'm going to hold down Control and I'm going to double click on one edge. So I have one edge, the entire length of this thing deselected. Okay, the only other thing I'm going to do is I don't want it to sew the very ends because of the same problem. I want it to unroll, so I don't want these guys to be all sewn together here, but laying them out flat. They'll all kind of pin together at the edge. So what I'm going to do is deselect the end of the cable here, and I'm going to rotate this around and hold down Control and deselect this. So as you can see, in this long cylinder, I've left one slice open on the end, and I want all of these not sewn together here. Okay, so the result of this is if I go into the UV editor and I hit the move and sew, what we get is all of the faces. Now they're all square because all I've done is sew them, but they are now all sewn back together again, and I've flattened out this twisty turny sort of a thing. What I'm going to do is go into UVs, grab the whole shoot match, and over here, or from over here, we have a unfold tool. Okay, right here on the icon, I can grab it this way. And all I'm going to do is grab this, oops, and it's going to try to do its best. And its best could be somewhere in here. take this and try this again, something like this, and maybe like this. And up here is a little bit chunky, so maybe we might have to do some repair work on it, but what we get is a flattened version of all of this. So when we take these UVs, if I scale them down like this, and move this over to here, and we scale this down like this. It's a bit too small. Let's just try that like this. But if we look at this now, particularly if I smooth it, what you'll get is your UVs all along the length of this object. Okay? So if you wanted to put a bump material or displacement material or a rusty material along this pipe or this cord, this way you could actually do that. Now, how fastidious you plan on being about this, you may want to straighten all these out, you might want to pull these, and that's completely up to you. And there are times when you will absolutely have to do stuff like that. You want to straighten out your borders. The one thing I would definitely do here is, because we're outside of the 0 to 1 space, is that we'll probably want to go into edge mode and grab these edges, and what I'll do is I'll just flatten this out. Grab these edges right here, kind of the halfway mark, so it should have about 6 or 7 up, 6 or 7 down, and I am going to cut right along there. Then what I can do is just grab this, and this will pick me an island, right? So I can grab one island and put it there, and grab the other island and put it there, right? And pack those two guys in. Oops, there you go. So you may want to do that, but this allows you to get more texture space per, and that may not be enough. Maybe you want to do more. So you might want to cut these guys into quarters, and then this way you can get even more detail on that. Now again, you're probably going to want to do something with these UVs to kind of, you know, clean them up a little bit. You know, bring these guys up to here, these guys to here, those to here, these guys to there, there, and there, something like that. And you can certainly grab the ones on the ends to there, and you have options for bringing those out. And then you can grab these guys here. I can get to this. It's going to be an abject nightmare. Like this, and you can bring those again out to there, and you can just start scrubbing them and cleaning them that way. They looked pretty good, and for the amount of time, I mean, if this was a really prominent piece, you might want to really do that. But for the most part, I think if it was a distortion, if it was a piece that was going to be showing up in the piping above you or something, and you just needed the displacement map to read, if we were going to do that sort of trick where this looked like a corrugated pipe, I think you'd be fine. And you know, time is money, so you get it looking as good as it needs to get. If you needed to get in here and scrub all the positions of this, you certainly can. This tool set over here allows you to align them. There are better tools for doing this. Sometimes not even in Maya. That's a whole other conversation, but hopefully this made sense. UVs are tricky. They can be fast and immediate, and sometimes they can be slow and cumbersome. So do your best, and if you have any questions, post them on the Facebook group. Thank you very much.